accused of killing a jogger in Howard Beach, Queens. The video of Channel Lewis was played today for the jury. He is charged with the murder of Karina Vrono.
About how many times did you hit her in the face?
Around 5.
Was she still moving when you had your hands around her neck?
Oh, yeah, and then she dropped into the water. After that, she was just lying there.
During an interrogation 6 months after the August 2016 murder, officers say the 22-year-old Lewis said he did not previously know his victim. Police say he said he attacked her because he was upset with a neighbor for playing loud music. Lewis's attorney says police coerced his confession by keeping him in isolation during the 6.
It was 10:30 at night. A group of police officers were moving slowly through a marsh in Brooklyn, cutting through reeds that stood 10 feet tall, using machetes just to move forward. The air was thick. The visibility was almost zero. Then they heard it. A man. Screaming. They ran toward the sound, and when they got there, they found a father on his knees in the mud, hunched over his daughter's body. His hands were shaking. His voice was breaking. Officers tried to pull him away, but he wouldn't move. He couldn't move. He just kept saying the same thing, over and over. I have to take my daughter home. I have to take my daughter home. Her name was Karina. She was 30 years old. And just a few hours earlier, she had simply gone out for a run. Now here's what's going to stay with you. When detectives processed the crime scene, they discovered something that told them everything they needed to know about the kind of woman Karina was and the kind of fight she put up. She had bitten her attacker so hard that she broke her own teeth. And that one detail, that single brutal act of defiance, is what ultimately led investigators to the killer. But what they found when they got there? Several detectives said they needed psychological help afterward. One of them said it honestly gave them chills. This is not a straightforward murder case. There are 2 trials, a mistrial, a confession that defense attorneys called coerced, a DNA sweep of over 360 men, an anonymous letter allegedly written by a police officer sent to the defense team the night before closing arguments, and a father who still visits the exact spot where he found his daughter's body every single morning. Stay with me, because this story doesn't go where you think it's going. Karina was the kind of person who made every room feel a little more alive the moment she walked into it. At just 4 feet 11 inches tall, she was small in stature but enormous in everything else: energy, determination, laughter, presence. Her best friend Erica described her as a tiny firework. She said Karina had this contagious laugh that could fill an entire room before she even finished the joke. She had earned a master's degree from St. John's University and was working as a speech therapist in Manhattan, helping children with communication disabilities. She wasn't just good at her job, she was passionate about it. The kind of person who stays late, who remembers your kid's name, who texts a parent on a Saturday just to share a small win. On top of that, she worked part-time as a promoter at a club in Astoria, where she was known for being warm, sharp, and completely unbothered by the chaos of the nightlife world. She was building a life, brick by brick, with intention and joy. She lived with her parents in Howard Beach, a quiet, tight-knit neighborhood on the southern edge of Queens. Her father, Phil, was a retired firefighter. He was also her running partner. Most mornings and evenings, the 2 of them would head out together along the trails of Spring Creek Park, a natural preserve that covered about 2 square miles, stretching across sections of Brooklyn and Queens. The park was full of overgrown brush, tall weeds, and winding paths that cut through marshland and meadow. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed kind of way, and it sat just a few blocks from their front door. Running was their thing. It was how they stayed close, how they talked through the stuff that's hard to say sitting still. Phil knew those trails the way you only know a place when you've loved it for years. But on August 2nd, 2016, he didn't go. He had a back injury, nothing serious, just enough to keep him off the trail for the day. And when Karina laced up her shoes and told him she was heading out anyway, he hesitated. The area was isolated. Parts of it were essentially unmaintained wilderness. He told her he didn't think it was a great idea for her to go alone. She smiled at him. "Don't worry," she said. "I'll be fine." Just before she walked out the door, she stopped to take a selfie. A quick, casual photo, the kind you take without thinking. In the background of the image, you can see her mother Kathy walking past behind her. Karina is smiling. That photo would later become one of the last images her family would ever have of her alive. She stepped outside at around 5 in the afternoon. The sun was still up. The air was warm. It was a perfectly ordinary summer evening in New York City. 45 minutes later, Phil said something shifted inside him. He couldn't explain it. There was no reason for it, not yet. But he described it as a feeling that settled over him suddenly, like a door closing somewhere deep in his chest. Something just wasn't right. He waited. He told himself he was being overprotective. He tried to shake it off. 2 hours passed. Karina hadn't come home. He called her phone. No answer. He called again. And again. Silence every single time. Phil reached out to a childhood friend who was working with the New York City Police Department. A patrol car was sent to the area almost immediately, but officers couldn't find her. And as the minutes continued to pile up with no sign of her, the search expanded fast. Units from the 106th Precinct were called in. Officers began moving through the park with flashlights and machetes, hacking through reeds that in some places reached 10 feet high. Even as night fell and the temperature dropped, they kept going. NYPD Detective Barry Brown was one of the officers working the search. He later said there was a heaviness in the air that night that was difficult to describe. At one point, someone said out loud what everyone was already thinking. This doesn't feel right. Phil was out there with them. Using the geolocation signal from Karina's phone, investigators had begun narrowing down a section of the park, a marshy, overgrown area roughly 15 feet off the running trail. Neighbors had complained about that stretch for years. The weeds were so thick that even in daylight, you could barely see 10 feet in front of you. And then, at 10:30 that night, everything stopped. Officers heard a man scream. They ran toward the sound and found Phil, collapsed on the ground, both arms wrapped around his daughter. She was lying face down in the mud. He would not let go of her. He couldn't. Officers eventually had to physically restrain him and pull him away from her body, and even then, he kept reaching back toward her, kept repeating the same words through his tears. I have to take my daughter home. I have to take her home. I want to pause here for just a second, because I'm genuinely curious where my audience is watching from right now. If you don't mind, drop your city and the time in the comments. It always blows me away how far this community reaches. Now, let's keep going. When detectives began examining the crime scene, what they found was devastating, but it was also, in a strange and heartbreaking way, a portrait of who Karina was right up until her very last breath. There were bruises across her face. Her teeth were broken. There were deep abrasions covering her legs, consistent with being dragged across rough ground. Her athletic top and shorts had been pulled down, and investigators noted evidence pointing toward sexual assault. One of her hands was gripping the grass so tightly that even in death, she hadn't let go. Detectives believed it meant she had been dragged, that she had grabbed onto anything she could find, fighting to stop herself from being pulled further from the trail. She had fought hard. She had fought with every single thing she had. At some point during the struggle, Karina had managed to bite her attacker with enough force to snap her own teeth. She didn't just bite him. She held on. And in doing so, she left behind the kind of biological evidence that investigators knew could eventually identify whoever did this. The medical examiner's office later confirmed what detectives already suspected. The cause of death was strangulation. Whoever had killed her had pressed their hand against her neck so hard and for so long that the imprint of that hand was still visible on her skin when officers found her. Chief of Detectives Boyce, who would go on to lead the investigation, later said it was obvious that Karina had fought until the very end. That conclusion wasn't an assumption. It was written all over the crime scene. Phil later said he always believed it was meant to be him who found her. She led me to her, he said. She needed her dad to be the one who found her. There's no doubt about that. And if you're new here, this is Crime Motives. We don't just tell you what happened. We walk through every piece of the puzzle, every wrong turn, every breakthrough, until the full picture is in front of you. If that's the kind of storytelling you're here for, hit that subscribe button right now, because what comes next in this case is where things get complicated in ways nobody expected. In the days that followed, the NYPD threw significant resources at the case. Dozens of detectives fanned out across Howard Beach and the surrounding neighborhoods, interviewing landscapers, construction workers, local residents, anyone who might have seen something on the afternoon of August 2nd. A tractor with an industrial mower was brought to the crime scene. Officers continued clearing the dense brush 300 feet at a time, trying not to disturb any potential evidence as they worked. Because the land where Karina's body was found was federally owned, the NYPD also brought in the FBI. Federal agents provided additional resources, including drones to survey the terrain from the air. But the most important piece of evidence wasn't a footprint or a fiber or a surveillance image. It was DNA. Investigators had managed to recover genetic material from under Karina's fingernails and from her cell phone, which was found just a few feet from her body. They built a full DNA profile from that material, and when they ran it through the national database, no match. Whoever had done this wasn't in the system, which meant one of two things. Either this was someone who had never been arrested, ever, or it was someone who had been arrested before 1998, when the National DNA Database was first established. Either way, investigators had a profile and no name to put to it. The community was rattled in a way that's hard to overstate. This wasn't a crime that happened late at night in a dark alley. Karina had gone out in the afternoon. It was still daylight when she entered that park. People who jogged those trails every single day suddenly didn't feel safe anymore. A GoFundMe was launched for a reward fund. The NYPD contributed $25,000. The mayor's office added another $10,000. Eventually, thousands of everyday people donated too. Investigators also looked into Karina's personal life for any possible connections. Friends told detectives about a man named Paul, an employee at the nightclub where she worked part-time. He had reportedly made unwanted advances toward her on multiple occasions and had become aggressive when she turned him down. Some friends believed he may have been following her, but when investigators checked his alibi, it held. He was at work at the time of the murder. Paul was ruled out. Around the same time, detectives in Massachusetts reached out to the NYPD. They were investigating the murder of a 27-year-old woman named Vanessa, a Google account manager who had gone out for a run on August 7th, just 5 days after Karina's death, and whose body had been found in a wooded area near where she was staying. The similarities were striking: a young woman, a running trail, a wooded area, a brutal end. Investigators in New York said they took the inquiry seriously and looked for any forensic connection between the two cases. But they could not confirm a link. The cases would eventually be resolved separately, each with their own suspect and their own verdict. For weeks, the Karina investigation moved forward without a clear break. And then in late August, a man came forward. A Verizon employee had been working in Spring Creek Park on the day of the murder. He contacted police and told detectives he had seen someone, a man who seemed out of place. The man was wearing a wool cap. On August 2nd, in the middle of a New York summer, with temperatures well above 80 degrees. Based on that description, investigators worked with the witness to produce a composite sketch. It was released to the public on August 31st. The sketch showed a black man, described as being around 5 feet 10 inches tall, between 35 and 45 years old, with a medium build, and that wool hat, distinctive and strange against the heat of an August afternoon. Before we keep going, I just want to say, hit that like button if you're still with me. It costs you nothing, and it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who want to understand these stories the way they deserve to be understood. Okay, back to it. After the composite sketch was released, a former NYPD supervisor, who is now working as a head of security at a residential building in Brooklyn, picked up the phone and called Chief Boyce directly. He said one of the tenants in the building looked strikingly similar to the man in the sketch. Police went to the apartment. The man, identified only as Kevin, refused to open the door. Officers waited outside the building until he eventually came out on his own. Kevin acknowledged the resemblance to the sketch and was taken to the precinct for questioning. Once inside the interrogation room, he refused to provide a DNA sample. Detective Barry Brown later said that refusal immediately changed the energy in the room. Everyone noticed it. When someone refuses to give a DNA sample in a murder investigation, especially without a lawyer present, it sets off alarm bells. But police had options. When Kevin discarded a water bottle during his time at the precinct, investigators retrieved it and extracted his DNA from it. Legally obtained. Scientifically clean. The results came back. Kevin's DNA did not match the profile from the crime scene. Just like that, investigators were back at square one. The sketch had led nowhere. The DNA had cleared the only person of interest they had. And the weeks were becoming months. Phil refused to stop pushing. Even as the investigation appeared to stall publicly, he was working behind the scenes, researching investigative methods, talking to experts, trying to find any path that hadn't yet been tried. One of the methods he kept coming back to was called familial DNA searching, a technique that uses specialized software to look not for an exact match in the database, but for a close enough match to suggest a biological relative of the suspect might already be in the system. If investigators could find a brother, a cousin, a parent, someone in the database who shared enough genetic markers, they might be able to narrow the field dramatically. At the time, familial DNA searching was being used in 9 states. New York was not one of them. Phil started a petition. He gave interviews. He showed up at hearings. The ACLU pushed back, arguing that the practice could sweep innocent family members into criminal investigations through no fault of their own. Phil didn't care. He said that kind of thinking was ignorant of the facts, that they were talking about targeting criminals, not punishing families. The petition gained traction. New York eventually took notice. But the breakthrough that actually cracked this case open didn't come from a database or a petition or a new piece of technology. It came from a memory. In January 2017, nearly 6 months after Karina's murder, Lieutenant John Russo sat down to review the case files. Russo was one of the detectives who had been at the crime scene the night Phil found Karina. He also lived in Howard Beach. He knew the area. He knew the trails. And as he went through the files, something surfaced. A memory from May 2016, 3 months before the murder. Russo had been near his home in Howard Beach when he noticed a man walking away from him on the other side of the street. The man was wearing a tracksuit, long sleeves, hood pulled up over his head. On a day when the temperature was pushing 80 degrees. At the time, Russo had watched the man for a moment, noticed him glancing at nearby houses in a way that seemed off, and called the police. By the time officers arrived, the man was gone. The very next day, neighbors called to report someone matching the same description, a man in a black and white tracksuit, walking onto private properties in the area without any apparent reason. Russo ran into the man again shortly after that and stopped him. Asked for his name. Chanel Lewis. At the time, Russo had filed it away and moved on. Just a strange encounter. One of hundreds he'd had over the years. He figured their paths would never cross again. But sitting there in January 2017, something about that name wouldn't leave him alone. He pulled on that thread. He started digging. Chanel Lewis had no criminal record. But he had accumulated several summonses connected to the Brooklyn side of Spring Creek Park, the section directly across from where Karina's body had been found. He was known to spend time in the park. He knew those trails. Russo called Chief Boyce. Boyce later said there was something in Russo's voice that made him sit up straight. Something in the way he delivered the information. There was something in his voice, Boyce said, that made me think this might actually be the one. They jumped on it immediately. Investigators began talking to Chanel Lewis. He was 20 years old at the time. He told detectives he knew the area well, that he was mostly a loner, that he liked to walk the trails to listen to music and clear his head. He didn't seem alarmed. He cooperated willingly. He voluntarily provided a DNA sample. While they waited for the results, investigators began building a picture of who Chanel Lewis was. They visited his former high school and spoke to former classmates and staff. What they found was a portrait of a young man whose life had been marked by isolation, instability, and deeply troubling behavior, but also by a complicated kind of sympathy. Former classmates described him as a loner who was relentlessly bullied. He was mocked for the way he dressed, the way he looked, the way he carried himself. Sometimes he tried to fight back. Usually he didn't. He walked the halls with his hood pulled up over his head, shoulders in, trying to disappear. Many of the people who knew him said they never saw him as aggressive or confrontational, just quiet, invisible. But there were other reports too. In May 2011, when Lewis was 15 years old, school staff reported that he had told a teacher's aide he wanted to stab his female classmates. He was taken into custody, transported to a hospital for psychiatric evaluation, and later released. The following month, there was another incident. He allegedly threatened a female student and her family. Another hospitalization. Another release. One tabloid claimed he had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, though that claim was never independently verified by any other outlet. He was eventually transferred to a private school for students with emotional and behavioral challenges, where he graduated in August 2015. The executive director of that school later stated that during his time there were no disciplinary incidents, no threatening statements, and no reports of any kind filed against him. The picture of Chanel Lewis was contradictory in the way that many things are contradictory when they're real, complicated, layered, and impossible to reduce to a single story. Then his father added one more piece. He told investigators that Chanel could not have committed the murder because the day after it happened, he had taken his son to a hospital. Chanel had a hand injury. He said he'd gotten it in a fight. Investigators tracked down the hospital. They found the doctor who had treated him. And, according to Detective Barry Brown, the doctor told them something that shifted the entire case. He had removed a foreign object from Chanel Lewis's hand. The DNA sample from Lewis's voluntary swab was processed. The results came back. It was a match. Chanel Lewis's DNA matched the genetic profile recovered from Karina's fingernails, her neck, and her cell phone. And that foreign object removed from his hand? Investigators now believed it was a fragment of Karina's broken tooth, the tooth she had snapped when she bit him with everything she had during the attack. She had left a piece of herself inside her killer's body. And 6 months later, a doctor had pulled it out of him without knowing what it was. She had fought until the very end. And in the end, her fight had found him. On February 5, 2017, Chanel Lewis was taken to the 107th precinct for questioning. The interview was recorded. Investigators asked him about the evening of August 2nd. He said he had been in Spring Creek Park, by himself, listening to music. Then they asked him what happened. He paused. "There's this girl jogging," he said. "And then, one thing led to another." He said he got angry. He said he grabbed her. He said he hit her in the face and in the mouth. He said the whole thing lasted about 5 minutes. He said he dragged her about 10 feet off the trail. When investigators asked him about his anger, where it came from, what triggered it, he talked about a man at his former address who played loud music and brought a lot of people around. He said it made him feel unsafe, uncomfortable. He said he liked things private and peaceful. He redirected that anger onto a woman he had never met in his life. Chanel Lewis was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. He was 20 years old. When officers walked him out of the building, reporters were waiting outside. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Why did you do it?" Lewis said nothing. But before the formal arrest was processed, he had already said something else, something quieter, to the detectives in the room. "Please tell my mom I'm sorry. I want to stop here for just a second because I feel this every time I tell a story like this." A man confesses to killing someone. He's in custody. The family finally has an answer. And somehow, the hardest part is still ahead of them. Stay with me, because what happens next in this courtroom is where the story gets even more painful. Chanel Lewis was formally indicted by a grand jury on 13 counts, charges related to both murder and sexual assault in connection with the death of Karina. He was held without bail. He pleaded not guilty. His family stood firmly behind him. His father told reporters they had the wrong person. His brother pointed out that Chanel was small and slight. How could someone like him overpower a woman described as physically fit and strong? His mother said she had raised her son to be God-fearing, to respect life, to be kind. She acknowledged that he had mental health struggles. She said he needed help, not prison. The legal proceedings formally began in November 2018, more than 2 years after Karina's death. The prosecution's case rested on 3 pillars: the DNA evidence, the recorded confessions, and a detailed record of internet searches Lewis had conducted in the months leading up to his arrest. Among those searches were queries about criminal indictments, plea deals, prosecution processes, and news coverage of Karina's murder specifically. The prosecution described Chanel Lewis as a frustrated, angry, and deeply isolated young man who had spotted Karina on a routine run and made the decision, in that moment, in that park, to take his rage out on a stranger. Assistant District Attorney Brad Leventhal told the jury, "He saw her and he killed her. She didn't provoke him. They crossed paths by chance." The defense told a very different story. Attorney Jenny Chung told jurors there would be no eyewitnesses. No one was going to walk into that courtroom and point at Chanel Lewis and say they saw him do it. She argued that the police department, under enormous public pressure to close a high-profile case, had zeroed in on Lewis and worked backward, building a theory around him rather than following the evidence where it actually led. She described the prosecution's approach as trying to force a square peg into a round hole. The defense also attacked the confession directly. Chanel's interrogation had lasted more than 10 hours. His attorneys argued that he had agreed to speak and eventually to confess, not because he was guilty, but because he was mentally vulnerable, exhausted, and desperate to leave. Defense attorney Robert Mueller also raised concerns about the crime scene itself, pointing out that multiple people, including Karina's father, had been present before investigators arrived, which he argued compromised the integrity of the DNA evidence. The trial lasted 7 days. Then it went to the jury. After a day and a half of deliberations, 5 jurors said they could not return a guilty verdict beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury was hung. The judge declared a mistrial. Karina's parents walked out of the courthouse in silence. No statements. No interviews. Just 2 people absorbing what it means to watch justice delayed, again, after 2.5 years of fighting for their daughter's name. The defense attorneys spoke. One of them said the jury understood that DNA alone is not everything, that a confession alone is not everything, and that this case was far more complex than the prosecution had presented. For the Vrono family, it meant starting over. Another trial. Another round of testimony. Another opportunity for the details of the worst night of their lives to be examined, debated, and questioned in a packed courtroom. Prosecutors spent the months between the mistrial and the retrial preparing. They brought in new evidence, specifically the comprehensive record of Chanel Lewis's internet searches, which they believed told its own story about his state of mind in the months following the murder. The retrial began in March 2019. Phil Vrono took the stand again. At one point during his testimony, he dropped to his knees in front of the jury. He was describing the moment he found his daughter. The mud, the dark, the weight of her body, the cold of her skin. He couldn't stay standing. Jurors in the front row were visibly emotional. Some looked away. Then, one day before the jury was scheduled to begin deliberations, something extraordinary happened. Defense attorneys received an anonymous letter. It was allegedly written by a member of the NYPD. The letter claimed that in the early stages of the investigation, senior police officials had directed detectives to look for 2 strong white men from Howard Beach, a direction that, according to the letter, had racial implications for how the investigation subsequently unfolded. The letter also claimed that during the broader investigation, police had conducted a mass DNA sweep in which samples were collected from more than 360 African-American men in Howard Beach and surrounding areas of Brooklyn and Queens. Lewis's attorneys filed an emergency motion, arguing that the information amounted to racial profiling and that it constituted exculpatory evidence that should have been disclosed to the defense long before the retrial. They asked for a hearing. The prosecution responded swiftly. The assistant district attorney called the letter anonymous and unverifiable and said whoever had written it was clearly attempting to disrupt the proceedings at the last possible moment. A police spokesperson said the investigation had been thorough, lawful, and driven entirely by evidence, and that multiple court hearings across 2 years had already examined and dismissed these kinds of claims. The judge denied the defense's request for a hearing. The case went to the jury. On April 1, 2019, the verdict was announced. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted. Karina's mother, Kathy, buried her face in her hands. Phil closed his eyes. People around them were crying, reaching for each other. Chanel Lewis stood at the defense table, motionless, as the verdict was read. Then he raised his handcuffed hands in a slow wave toward his family and supporters seated in the gallery. Outside the courthouse, Phil looked into the cameras and said 2 words, "Thank you, Jesus." But even then, even after a guilty verdict in a second trial, the case wasn't finished. Sentencing was delayed when the defense filed a claim of juror misconduct. According to the motion, one juror had allegedly told others during deliberations that she had been a rape survivor and had used that personal experience to explain away the absence of certain DNA evidence in the sexual assault kit. Another juror had allegedly referenced a previous rape case he'd served on as a juror and used the details of that unrelated case to draw conclusions about the evidence in this one. The defense argued that these actions had introduced facts outside the official record, effectively turning those jurors into unsworn expert witnesses. The juror in question denied ever saying she had been raped. The district attorney submitted sworn statements defending the jury's conduct, arguing that jurors are permitted to draw on their life experience and common sense during deliberations, and that nothing that happened in that jury room constituted misconduct. The judge reviewed everything and rejected the claims entirely. Sentencing could finally proceed. April 23, 2019. More than 2.5 years after Karina Vrono went out for a run and never came home. The courtroom was full. Family on both sides. Supporters on both sides. Kathy Vrono sat in the front row holding a cross in both hands. Chanel Lewis's mother sat across the aisle, holding a Bible, tears streaming down her face. One by one, Karina's family and friends approached the microphone and spoke directly to the man who had been convicted of killing her. Karina's mother stood up and faced the court. She was holding a pair of shoes, small, worn, recognizable. "These are Karina's shoes," she said. "These are the shoes she put on the morning of August 2nd. As tiny as they are the shoes of a giant, a valiant warrior and a queen." She turned and looked directly at Lewis. "The vacant expression you show is merely a reflection of your detached and empty soul." Phil spoke last. He told Chanel Lewis that his daughter had a message for him, that if Lewis stood up in that courtroom and asked for her forgiveness, truly asked, she would forgive him. "But those are not my words," Phil said. "And I will never forgive you." He also told the court what the loss of Karina had done to their family. There were no more Merry Christmases. No more Happy New Years. No more birthdays that felt like celebrations instead of reminders. He said the only thing keeping him alive, the only thing keeping him moving through each day, was staying involved in the fight for her memory. The judge sentenced Chanel Lewis to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 32 years for the second-degree murder and sexual assault convictions. Lewis spoke briefly at the end. "I'm innocent," he said, "and I'm sorry for the family's loss. But I didn't do this." His conviction did not go unchallenged. Around 40,000 people eventually signed a petition calling for the case to be reviewed by a conviction integrity unit, citing concerns about the DNA sweep, the anonymous letter, the length of the interrogation, and the pressure investigators had been under to close such a public case quickly. Those who believed in his innocence argued that the system had failed him, that a young black man with a history of mental health challenges had been made to fit a narrative that law enforcement needed. The legal system, after 2 trials, a mistrial, claims of juror misconduct, and years of appeals and motions, reached its final answer. Guilty. Life without parole. For the justice system, the case was closed. For the Vrono family, nothing will ever fully close. Phil has spoken about that openly and honestly. About the way grief doesn't end with a verdict, about the way mournings still arrive with the weight of everything that's missing, about the hole that no sentence, no matter how severe, can actually fill. But he keeps going. He keeps showing up. There is a memorial in Spring Creek Park now, tucked into the place where the trail bends and the reeds grow tall. A butterfly made of stones. An angel figure. Candles that visitors still light years later. And most mornings, a man standing quietly in that spot, hands in his pockets, face turned toward wherever she is. Phil goes there every single day. He says it's the only place he can find any peace. And he knows how strange that sounds, choosing to find peace in the exact place where he found her lying in the mud. But he says he has some sense of control there, some closeness. If she could be here today, what would you say to her? A reporter once asked him. Phil shook his head slowly. I speak to her every day, he said. Every single day I speak to her. And she speaks to us. In volumes. Karina Vrono was 30 years old. She had a master's degree. She worked with children who struggled to find their voice. She had a laugh that filled rooms and a spark that people felt from across a crowded space. She was the kind of daughter who took selfies in the hallway before a run, not knowing her mother was walking past in the background, not knowing it would be the last photo her family ever had of her smiling. On an ordinary Tuesday evening in August, she laced up her shoes, kissed her dad on the cheek, and went for a run. She never came back. That simple, brutal fact became the center of this entire story. Not just the investigation, not just the trials, not the DNA, not the confession, not the verdict. The center of it is her, Karina, who she was, what she brought into every room she walked into, and what left with her when she didn't come home. Her father is working on getting her blog published as a book. There is a scholarship in her name at Archbishop Malloy High School. There are people who knew her, and people who never met her but followed this case, who still carry her name with them. Before you go, I want to hear from you. What do you think about this case? Do you believe justice was truly served? Do you have doubts? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, share it with someone. These stories deserve to be heard, and the people at the center of them deserve to be remembered as more than just a headline. Karina was more than a headline. A lot more. Thank you for watching Crime Motives. I'll see you in the next one.